The morning of her wedding, Talia Rook sharpened the same knife 3 times. Not because it needed it, because her hands wanted something to do besides shake. Outside her window, verdant spanners, deep green, a wolf howling at a crescent moon, hung beside Caldronor's black and red standard for the first time in 40 years, stitched together on the same pole like the two kingdoms hadn't spent 4 decades trying to kill each other over a strip of border forest neither side actually needed. "You don't have to do this," her father said from the doorway. He didn't come in. He never came in anymore, not since the treaty negotiations started, not since he'd traded her like the last good horse in a losing bargain. "Yes," Talia said, still turning the blade in her hands, "I do." She'd buried her brother 11 months ago. Killed on the Ashfall border by a Caldronor patrol, by the king himself, some said, though nobody had ever proven it, and Talia had stopped needing proof a long time before her father sat her down and told her the price of peace had a name. Bastian Voss, the Alpha King of Caldronor, the man whose army had spent 4 decades grinding verdant forests into battlefields. The man she was marrying in 6 hours, in front of both kingdoms, to end a war that had already taken everything from her worth keeping. She didn't hate him because someone told her to. She hated him because she'd earned it. She had no idea, sharpening a knife she had no intention of using, and every intention of keeping close, that the war she'd spent 11 months grieving wasn't actually over. It was about to become something worse. And the man she was about to marry was the only person on either side of the border who might understand exactly how much worse, before it was too late for either kingdom to survive it. 42 years. That was how long Verdance and Caldronor had bled each other over the Ashfall forest, a stretch of border woodland that produced good timber and better hunting, and had somehow, across 2 generations, become the kind of wound neither kingdom knew how to stop picking at. Nobody alive remembered exactly how it started. There were 3 different versions depending on which side of the river you asked, and all 3 blamed the other kingdom entirely, which was Talia had come to understand by the time she was old enough to hold a sword, usually how these things worked. What she did remember, with a clarity that never dulled no matter how much time passed, was her brother Corin's face the last time she saw it, laughing, 23 years old, riding out on a routine patrol he'd done 100 times before. He didn't come back. Neither did 4 of the 6 men who rode with him. Caldronor called it a border skirmish, an unfortunate accident of 2 patrols meeting where they shouldn't have. Verdance called it murder. Talia had spent 11 months calling it a debt. The treaty that ended the war, brokered, finally, after a winter so brutal it killed more soldiers on both sides than either army had managed in the previous decade, required exactly the kind of gesture old enemies always seemed to reach for when they ran out of better ideas: a marriage. A bond between the 2 ruling houses, sealed not by the moon's choosing but by 2 exhausted kingdoms' desperate need for the fighting to simply, finally stop. Talia Rook, Verdan's last surviving royal heir, was the obvious choice. Bastian Voss, Caldronor's Alpha King, was the only choice on his side that carried the weight to make the peace mean anything. Neither of them had been asked exactly. They'd been informed, the way a soldier is informed of orders rather than consulted about strategy, and both of them, for reasons that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with 2 kingdoms too tired to keep leading, had agreed. What neither kingdom's council understood, what neither Talia nor Bastian fully understood themselves, not yet, was that the same brutal winter that had finally forced both sides toward peace hadn't come from nowhere. Something had been pushing south through the Ashfall forest for months, something neither army's scouts had properly identified, something that fed, quietly and patiently, on exactly the kind of chaos and bloodshed 42 years of border war had left scattered across that contested ground like an open invitation. The wedding was supposed to end one war. It was about to become the only thing standing between both kingdoms, and a considerably worse one. Bastian Voss stood at the altar and watched Verdant's princess walk toward him like she was approaching an execution, her own, or maybe his. It was hard to tell from the set of her jaw. He didn't blame her. He'd have looked exactly the same, marrying the man whose kingdom had killed his brother if their positions had been reversed. Some nights, lying awake in a war tent counting the men his own decisions had gotten killed, he wasn't entirely sure their positions weren't reversed in ways nobody had bothered totaling up. "You could smile," his beta, Rurik, murmured beside him. "For the optics, if nothing else." "I could," Bastian agreed and didn't. She reached the altar. Up close, she was smaller than he expected, not weak. Nothing about the way she carried herself suggested weak, but compact, coiled tight, the kind of small that made people underestimate exactly how much damage it could do if provoked. Her eyes, when they finally met his, held nothing but cold, controlled fury. "Your Majesty," she said, the title landing like an insult dressed in courtesy. "Lady Talia." He kept his own voice level. Neutral. For decades of war had taught him that neutral was usually the safest place to stand. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of formal Verdance liturgy Bastian only half understood. Considerable pageantry meant to convince two exhausted kingdoms that this particular gesture actually meant something beyond political necessity.
He said the words he was supposed to say.
She said hers, flat and precise, like she was reading terms of surrender rather than vows. Neither of them touched more than was strictly required. The reception afterward was worse. Hours of careful, watchful nobility from both sides, testing the air for signs the peace might already be cracking, Talia's hand cold and stiff in his own whenever ceremony demanded they be seen together. "Your soldiers killed my brother," she said, quietly, during one of the rare moments they stood alone, guests circling at a polite distance that still somehow felt like an audience. "I know," Bastian said. "You know." Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, maybe, that he hadn't denied it, hadn't offered some careful political deflection. "Do you know his name?" "Corin Rook, 23. Ashfall Patrol, 11 months ago." Bastian kept his eyes on hers, refusing to look away from whatever this cost him to say. "I didn't give the order that killed him."
"I want you to know that."
"But I commanded the army that did, and I've spent 11 months understanding exactly how little that distinction actually matters to you." Talia stared at him for a long moment, something considerably more complicated than fury moving behind her eyes now. "It doesn't," she said finally.
"Matter."
"The distinction." "I know," Bastian said again, and this time it cost him more to say it. She turned away without another word, and Bastian watched her go, understanding with a clarity that settled cold and unwelcome in his chest that whatever peace this marriage was meant to buy, it was going to be built on considerably more grief than either kingdom's careful treaty language had accounted for. Caldronor's capital looked nothing like Verdance, where her home had been built from pale stone and green-roofed towers, half swallowed by forest on every side. Caldronor rose gray and fortified from bare rock, every building carrying the particular hardness of a kingdom that had spent generations expecting attack. Talia's rooms overlooked the training yard. She was fairly certain that hadn't been an accident. "You'll want for nothing here," the steward told her, on her first morning, gesturing at wardrobes already filled with unfamiliar dresses in Caldronor's dark colors. "His Majesty has instructed the staff to accommodate whatever you require." "What I require," Talia said, "is to go home." The steward's expression flickered. Not unkindness, exactly, just the particular discomfort of a man with no good answer to give her. "I'll pass that along, my lady." He wouldn't. They both knew he wouldn't. She spent the first week largely alone, exploring a fortress that felt less like a home and more like a very well-appointed prison, avoiding the training yard's noise whenever possible, avoiding Bastian entirely whenever she could manage it. It didn't always work. She found him on the 7th evening, in what she'd assumed was an empty library wing, standing before a wall of old maps with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful, controlled neutrality of the wedding, something closer to genuine exhaustion. "I didn't know anyone came here," he said, not quite an apology. "I'll leave." "You don't have to." He gestured vaguely at the maps. "It's the only room in this fortress that doesn't feel like it's waiting for a war." Talia hesitated in the doorway, old instinct telling her to walk away. Something else. Curiosity, maybe, or just exhaustion with her own careful anger, keeping her feet planted. "Why maps?" she asked finally. "My father's collection." He believed a king who didn't understand his own borders. Every stream, every ridge, had no business defending them. Bastion's mouth twisted, something wry and tired in it. "I used to think that was wisdom. Lately, I think it might have just been his way of avoiding actual people." "Is that what you're doing?" Talia asked. "Avoiding actual people? Would you blame me, given the particular person I share a fortress with currently?" It wasn't quite a joke.
It wasn't quite not one either.
Talia found herself, despite 11 months of carefully cultivated fury, almost, wanting to laugh. She didn't. "I'm going to bed," she said instead, and left him alone with his maps. She thought about the conversation more than she wanted to, lying awake that night in an unfamiliar room, in an unfamiliar kingdom, married to a man she'd spent 11 months hating with a clean, uncomplicated purity she found, disturbingly, considerably harder to maintain now that she'd actually spent time in the same room with him. It would have been easier if he'd been cruel. Easier if he'd been exactly the monster 11 months of grief had built in her mind. He wasn't. And Talia didn't know yet what to do with that particular, inconvenient truth. The first report came 3 weeks into the marriage, carried by a Caldronor scout so pale and shaking that Rurik had him seated before he'd finished delivering the message. "The Ashfall garrison," he said, "the whole eastern outpost gone. Not attacked.
Gone.
We found the building standing, cook fires still smoking, and not a single soldier, living or dead." Bastion, seated at his war table with Talia present, she'd insisted, over his initial objection, that anything happening along a border her own people still patrolled required her direct knowledge, felt something cold settle in his chest. "Gone how?" he asked. "Deserted? Captured?" "There's no sign of struggle, Your Majesty. No blood. No tracks leading away, not that our trackers could find. It's as if 40 men simply," the scout's hands shook, "stopped existing." "That's not possible," Talia said, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely certain of her own objection. "I agree it shouldn't be," Bastion said grimly. "Which is precisely why I intend to see it myself." They rode for the Ashfall border within the day. Bastion, Talia insisting on accompanying him despite Rurik's careful objections, a small, heavily armed escort from both kingdoms in a display of cooperation that would have seemed impossible 6 weeks earlier. The garrison, when they reached it, was exactly as described. Cook fires cold now, but clearly abandoned mid-meal. Weapons still racked. A half-written letter on a table, the ink dried mid-sentence. Talia crouched beside the letter, reading the unfinished words with a growing unease she couldn't quite name. "Mira, tell Mother I'll be home for the solstice. The patrols have been quiet lately, though something's been wrong with the deep woods. The trees have started." The sentence simply stopped. "Something's been wrong with the deep woods," she read aloud. That's the last thing this soldier wrote. Bastion, examining the treeline at the garrison's edge, went very still. "Talia." Something in his voice pulled her upright immediately. The forest beyond the garrison, the same Ashfall woods both kingdoms had bled each other over for 42 years, had changed. Not burned, not cut. The leaves hung wrong, gray and stiff instead of green, and the silence pressing out from beneath the canopy carried a weight that made every hair on Talia's arms rise at once. "I've fought in this forest my entire adult life," Bastion said quietly. "I've never seen it look like that." "Neither have I," Talia said, "and I grew up half a day's ride from here." They stood together at the treeline, 2 kingdoms worth of soldiers gathered nervously behind them, and understood, both of them, at exactly the same moment, that whatever had taken an entire garrison without leaving a single body behind hadn't come from either side of their 42-year border war. It had come from somewhere else entirely, and it was already inside the ground both their kingdoms had spent 4 decades fighting to claim. They didn't go into the forests that day. Bastion's instincts, honed by decades of war, refused to let him send anyone, himself included, into unfamiliar danger without considerably more preparation than a single afternoon's scouting could provide. They set up camp at the garrison instead, a joint force from both kingdoms working uneasily alongside each other for the first time in living memory, and Talia found herself, that night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that sat heavy in every muscle. She wasn't alone in that. She found Bastion outside her tent near midnight, staring toward the wrong-colored treeline with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of genuine worry. "You should be resting," she said. "So should you." "I couldn't." She sat down on a fallen log near his position, close enough for conversation, careful about the exact distance in a way that felt, increasingly, less like caution and more like habit she wasn't sure she still wanted to keep. "What do you think it is?" Bastion was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. I've fought men. I've fought wolves, storms, starvation. I've never fought something that takes an entire garrison and leaves the cook fires burning. There are old stories," Talia said slowly, "from my grandmother's time, about something that used to live deep in these woods, before either kingdom claimed them. She called it the Hollow. Said it fed on places where too much blood had been spilled too many times, and the land itself started to forget what it was supposed to be." "You believe that?" "I didn't," Talia admitted, "until today." Somewhere in the darkness beyond the treeline, something moved, not loudly, not close enough to see, just a shift in the wrong-colored leaves that made every soldier in camp go still at once, hands finding weapons without conscious decision. It passed. The forest settled back into its unnatural silence. 42 years, Bastion said quietly, once the tension had eased enough for conversation again. 42 years of soldiers dying in that forest on both sides. If your grandmother's stories carry any truth, then we fed it, Talia finished. Both kingdoms. Every single year we kept fighting over ground neither side actually needed badly enough to justify the cost. The realization settled between them with considerable, uncomfortable weight, not blame exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but a shared understanding that whatever waited in that forest now existed, at least in part, because 2 proud, stubborn kingdoms had spent 4 decades handing it exactly what it apparently needed to grow. "I killed men in that forest," Bastion said, voice low. "Men with families. Men like your brother. I told myself every single time that it served some larger purpose, territory, strategy, defending what was ours. I don't know anymore if any of that was ever actually true, or if we were simply feeding something neither side understood we were feeding." Talia looked at him, really looked, in a way she'd been carefully avoiding since the wedding, and found, for the first time, something other than fury when she considered exactly what this man had cost her. "I hated you," she said, "for 11 months. I sharpened a knife the morning of our wedding because some part of me hoped I might get the chance to use it." "I know," Bastion said. "I'd have understood if you had." "I don't hate you anymore," Talia said, surprising herself with how true it felt, saying it out loud for the first time. "I don't know what I feel instead."
But it isn't that.
Bastion didn't answer immediately. When he did, His voice carried something careful and uncertain that matched, precisely, the uncertain thing settling in Talia's own chest. "I'd like to find out," he said, "what it actually is. Once we've dealt with whatever's waiting in those woods." "Together?" Talia asked. "Together," Bastion agreed. "I don't think either kingdom survives what's coming if we try to face it alone." The scholars arrived 4 days later. 2 from Verdance, 1 from Caldronor, summoned urgently once word of the vanished garrison reached both capitals, and confirmed, with growing alarm, exactly what Talia's grandmother's old stories had suggested. "There are references," the eldest scholar said, an ancient Verdance woman named Ethel who'd spent 40 years studying pre-border folklore neither kingdom's formal histories bothered preserving, scattered through oral traditions on both sides of the Ashfall line. A presence tied to ground that's absorbed too much violent death across too many generations. The old texts call it different names depending on the source. Wound Eater, Hollow, Grief that forgot to end. How do you kill something like that? Bastion asked. "You may not be able to," Ethel said carefully. "Not through combat, certainly. Every account describes soldiers sent against it simply vanishing, the same as your garrison. It doesn't fight. It consumes." "Then what do the old stories say stops it?" Talia pressed. Ethel exchanged a careful glance with her Caldronor colleague, a younger scholar named Dorand who'd been quiet throughout most of the discussion. "The stories are consistent, on this point at least," Dorand said. "The Hollow feeds on unresolved conflict, grief that never finds its ending. It doesn't simply appear from nothing. It grows in ground where the same wound gets reopened, generation after generation, without anyone ever actually closing it." "You're saying our war fed it," Bastion said flatly. "I'm saying," Dorand corrected carefully, "that 42 years of unresolved conflict in the exact ground where this presence apparently originates would explain considerably more than simple coincidence. And I'm saying the stories suggest only one thing has ever actually stopped it, in the handful of accounts old enough to describe an ending at all." "Which is?" Talia asked. "Genuine resolution," Ethel said. "Not a treaty. Not a formal ceasefire signed by exhausted kings who'd simply run out of soldiers to send. Actual, complete closure, 2 sides who'd caused each other genuine, lasting harm, finding their way to something considerably more difficult than a truce." The war room fell silent, the weight of that particular requirement settling over everyone present. "That's considerably easier described than accomplished," General Harwin, Bastion's most senior military commander, said finally. 42 years of grief doesn't simply resolve because 2 scholars found an old story, suggesting it should. "No," Talia said slowly, something forming in her mind that she wasn't yet certain how to voice. "But maybe it doesn't need to resolve for 2 entire kingdoms all at once. Maybe it starts smaller. Maybe it starts with exactly the kind of forced, resentful peace this marriage was supposed to represent, actually becoming something real instead." Bastion looked at her, understanding passing between them without either needing to fully articulate it. "You're suggesting our marriage isn't simply a symbol of the treaty," he said. "You're suggesting it might be the actual mechanism that could stop this thing." "I'm suggesting," Talia said, "that a wound this old doesn't heal through paperwork. It heals through people. And right now, the only 2 people positioned to actually demonstrate that healing is possible are standing in this room." They didn't decide to go into the Ashfall forest lightly. 3 additional garrisons reported strange disturbances over the following 2 weeks. Livestock found frozen mid-motion, entire hunting parties returning with no memory of hours that had clearly passed, the rom-colored blight spreading outward from its original center with a patience that felt, to everyone watching it, considerably more unsettling than any straightforward attack would have. "The old accounts suggest proximity matters," Ethel explained, during the final strategy session before their departure. The presence responds to whoever approaches it carrying the actual conflict it feeds on. Which means, your majesties, that if this creature is genuinely tied to your kingdom's particular grief, the two of you may be the only people who can actually reach whatever center it's grown from without simply vanishing the moment you cross the trillion. That's a considerable gamble to base an entire strategy on, General Harwin said, clearly unhappy with the plan despite understanding they had few better options. It's the only strategy the old texts actually offer, Bastion said. And I'd rather gamble on genuine resolution than continue losing soldiers to something we don't understand well enough to fight conventionally. They entered the forest 3 days later, just the two of them, against Rurik's and Harwin's combined. Considerable objections, both scholars having confirmed that a larger force would likely only feed the presence further rather than genuinely address its cause. The wrongness of the woods pressed in from every direction the moment they crossed the trillion. Silence, too complete, gray leaves that crumbled to ash like dust at the barest touch, the particular cold that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with something considerably older and hungrier watching their progress. Stay close, Bastion said, quiet, his hand finding hers without quite seeming to decide to do it. Whatever else happens. Talia didn't pull away. I intend to. They walked for hours through the wrongness, following some instinct neither of them could fully articulate, deeper into the forest's dead heart, past clearings where the ground itself had gone gray and cracked, past the unmistakable, chilling stillness of soldiers frozen mid-stride, eyes open, apparently alive but utterly, terribly absent. Can we save them? Talia whispered, staring at a young Caldronor soldier caught forever mid-run, expression frozen somewhere between fear and confusion. I don't know, Bastion admitted. I hope so. They found the center of the blight in a clearing that had, Talia understood with a fresh chill, once been the exact site of the first major battle in their 42-year war, an old, overgrown killing field neither kingdom's histories bothered marking, forgotten by everyone except, apparently, the land itself. Something waited there. Not quite visible, not quite absent, a shape made of shadow and grief, and the particular gray absence of color that had spread through every dead leaf they'd passed, coalescing slowly, deliberately, as Talia and Bastion stepped into the clearing together. You feel that? Bastion asked, voice low.
Talia did.
A pull, deep and old, tugging at every grief she'd carried for 11 months, her brother's face, the particular hollow ache of a war that had cost her everything and settled nothing. It's trying to take something from us, she said. The same way it took the garrison. Then we don't give it the chance, Bastion said. We give it something else instead. The shape in the clearing didn't attack, exactly. It simply pressed closer, and Talia felt the pull of it sharpen, grief given weight and hunger, reaching for the specific, familiar shape of her own 11 months of fury and loss. Give it to me, something whispered, not quite words, more like pressure behind her own thoughts. Asterisk, you've carried it so long. Set it down, asterisk. She almost did. Some exhausted, grieving part of her. The part that had sharpened a knife on her wedding morning. The part that had spent 11 months rehearsing exactly how much she hated the man now standing beside her. Wanted, badly, to simply let go. Bastion's hand tightened around hers. Talia. His voice cut through the pressure, sharp and immediate. Look at me. Not it.
Me.
She turned, and the pull loosened, just slightly, at the sight of him. Not the enemy king she'd spent 11 months hating, but the man who'd stood beside her at an unfamiliar trillion 3 weeks ago and admitted, without flinching, exactly what his war had cost. It wants the grief, she said, understanding hitting her with sudden, sharp clarity. It's not trying to kill us. It's trying to feed on exactly what we're both still carrying. Then we can't let it, Bastion said. But I don't know how to simply stop grieving, Talia. Not for my own losses, and not for what my kingdom cost yours. Maybe that's not what it needs, Talia said slowly, the scholar's words finally clicking into place. Maybe it doesn't need the grief gone. It needs it resolved. Answered, instead of simply carried. She turned to face the shadow directly, understanding settling into her chest with the particular clarity of a decision she hadn't fully realized she was ready to make until the exact moment it arrived. My brother died in this forest, she said, voice steady despite everything pressing against her. Killed by soldiers under this man's command, in a war neither of us started and neither of us knew how to end. I spent 11 months hating him for it. I'm not doing that anymore. Beside her, Bastion's grip on her hand tightened further. I gave the orders that sent men into this forest for years, he said, his own voice carrying a weight Talia hadn't heard from him before. Not careful royal composure, something raw beneath it. I told myself it served a purpose I believed in. I don't know anymore if that was ever true.
I'm sorry, Talia.
For Corin. For every soldier this war cost both our kingdoms, in ground that apparently never should have been worth this much blood. The shadow in the clearing shuddered, not retreating, not yet, but something in its shape wavering, uncertain, like it had expected something else entirely and didn't yet know how to respond to what it was actually being offered. That's not an apology that fixes anything, Talia said, to Bastion, to the shadow, to 11 months of grief she'd carried like armor. It doesn't bring Corin back. It doesn't undo 42 years of both our kingdoms bleeding each other over ground neither of us needed badly enough to justify it. No, Bastion agreed. It doesn't. But it's true, Talia said. And maybe that's what this thing actually needs. Not grief that just gets carried forever. Grief that finally gets to be honest. The shadow's shudder deepened. Around them, the gray, ash-like leaves began, slowly, impossibly, to soften back towards something closer to genuine color. Pale at first, then stronger. Green pushing back through gray like something long buried, finally remembering how to breathe. It didn't happen all at once. The shadow didn't simply vanish, dramatic and complete, the way Talia had half expected from every old story she'd ever heard about creatures like this. It faded, slowly, reluctantly, like something enormous and old finally, exhaustedly letting go of a grip it had held for considerably longer than either of their kingdoms' entire histories. More, the pressure behind her thoughts whispered, fainter now. Asterisk, this is not enough. Not for 42 years. Asterisk. Talia looked at Bastion and understood, without either of them needing to say it aloud, exactly what came next. Every soldier who died in this forest, Bastion said, raising his voice, addressing not just the shadow but the entire clearing, the frozen soldiers still trapped somewhere in its wrongness, deserved a war worth their sacrifice. I don't believe, standing here, that they got one. I believe 42 years of both our kingdoms bled this ground for reasons that stopped making sense generations before either of us inherited them. My brother deserved to grow old, Talia said, her own voice carrying out into the clearing with a strength she hadn't expected to find. He deserved a life this border war stole from him for a strip of forest that turned out to be considerably more dangerous than either kingdom's stubbornness ever accounted for. I don't forgive that easily. I don't know if I forgive it at all. Not completely, not yet. But I refuse to let his death, or any of these deaths, keep feeding something that only grows stronger the longer we both keep hating each other over it. The frozen soldiers scattered through the blighted forest, the ones they passed, eyes open and terribly absent, began, one by one, to move. Slowly.
Confused.
Blinking, like they were waking from something considerably deeper than ordinary sleep. The shadow in the clearing thinned to almost nothing, a last, faint pressure against Talia's thoughts carrying something that might have been grief of its own, might have been simple, ancient exhaustion finally allowed to rest. Rare, it whispered, barely audible now. Asterisk rare, this kind of ending. Most simply keep feeding me instead. Asterisk. And then it was gone. Not violently, not with any dramatic final confrontation. Simply gone, the way a held breath finally releases, the clearing around them settling into something that felt, for the first time since they'd crossed the treeline, like an entirely ordinary forest. Talia realized she was still holding Bastion's hand. She hadn't let go once, through everything. Is it over? She asked, voice unsteady with exhaustion and something that felt, cautiously, like relief. I think so, Bastion said. I think, Talia, I think we actually did it. Around them, the confused, awakening soldiers began calling out to each other, disoriented but alive, and somewhere in that chaotic, overwhelming relief, Talia found herself laughing. Not the careful, controlled composure she'd maintained since her wedding day, something considerably more genuine, edged with exhaustion and disbelief, and a grief that hadn't disappeared but had, finally, found somewhere honest to rest. The journey back out of the forest took less time than the journey in, though neither of them said much throughout most of it. Exhausted, overwhelmed, still processing exactly what they'd just survived. It was near the treeline, close enough to see the garrison's cook fires still smoking in the distance, that Bastion finally stopped walking. Talia. She turned. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely uncertain. Not the composed Alpha King, not the careful diplomat, just a man who'd spent the last several hours confronting exactly how much his own war had cost, standing in the wreckage of that confrontation with no idea what to say next. I meant what I said back there, he said. About Corin. About all of it. I don't expect that to undo 11 months of you hating me, or 42 years of 2 kingdoms hating each other. I just needed you to know it was true, beyond whatever that creature needed to hear. I know it was true, Talia said. I could feel it was true. That's rather the point of what just happened, I think. Then what happens now? Bastion asked. Between us. I don't mean the treaty, or the peace, or anything either kingdom's council will want reported. I mean us, whatever this actually is. Talia considered the question, old grief and something new and cautiously hopeful tangling together in her chest. I don't hate you, she said. I told you that 3 weeks ago, and I meant it then too. I don't know if what's left, now that the hate's actually gone, is something bigger. I think it might be. I'm not ready to promise you that yet. I'm not asking for a promise, Bastion said. I'm asking if I can find out. Slowly. However long that actually takes. Talia looked at him. This man she'd married hating. This man who'd stood beside her in a clearing full of century-old grief and told the truth without flinching, and felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with the forced arrangement that had first brought them together. Yes, she said simply. You can find out. They walked the rest of the way back to the garrison in comfortable, exhausted silence, hands still loosely joined, and if anyone watching noticed that the Alpha King of Caldronor and the Princess of Verdance no longer walked like 2 people forced into each other's orbit against their will, nobody said anything about it. There would be time for that conversation later. For now, both kingdoms had a forest to properly bury, soldiers to reunite with families who'd believed them lost, and a peace that had finally, genuinely earned its name instead of simply borrowing it from a desperate treaty neither side had truly believed in. Spring came to the Ashfall Forest the following year, and for the first time in living memory, nobody from either kingdom needed to patrol its border with weapons drawn. Talia stood at the edge of the treeline on an ordinary afternoon. No ceremony, no gathered court, just herself and a basket of the first wildflowers to bloom in ground that had spent 42 years too soaked in old grief to grow much of anything worth noticing. Bastion found her there, as he often did these days, drawn by nothing more complicated than knowing where she liked to walk in the quiet hours between council sessions. "You're doing it again," he said, settling beside her without needing an invitation anymore. "Talking to the trees." "I'm not talking to the trees," Talia said, though the flowers in her basket suggested otherwise. "I'm bringing Corin something. He never got a proper grave here. Seemed wrong, after everything, not to leave him something." Bastian didn't say anything to that. He simply sat with her, quiet, while she laid the flowers at the base of an old oak that had somehow survived both the war and the blight that followed it, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling anymore, the kind two people settle into once they've stopped performing whatever version of themselves the world expected and started simply being who they actually were. "Rurik tells me the eastern villages want to reopen the old timber trade," he said eventually. "Properly this time. Joint contracts, shared profit, none of the old border disputes attached." "Good," Talia said. "Let something useful finally come out of this forest for once." She reached for his hand without quite deciding to, the way she'd started doing over the past year without either of them making much fuss about it, and he took it the same easy way, and they sat together at the edge of a forest that no longer remembered how to be a battlefield, watching the first wildflowers of spring push up through ground that had, finally, been allowed to simply heal. Neither of them said anything else for a long while. There wasn't anything that needed saying. Some peace, Talia had come to understand, didn't announce itself with grand declarations or full moons or gathered crowds. Some of it simply arrived, quiet and ordinary, in an afternoon spent sitting beside someone you'd once sworn to hate, flowers on a grave that finally had somewhere real to be, and a war that had, at long last, actually ended. The end.